That's what I want the world to do, of course, within the field, which I care deeply about. I do think sometimes I think we think about strategy in this sort of kind of a negative way as being somehow unethical to be strategic, to have goals. And so one of the things I think there's ways to do it that are unethical, but I also think there's ways to be strategic, which is to say help scientists achieve their goals. That's possible to do that ethically at the core of, and also in an evidence-based way. And a lot of our research is providing that evidence. And so it would be great if scientists used it. And so that's with the field. That's what I'm really interested in. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit different than a lot of my previous research. It's not about necessarily about trusts. It's not necessarily about, it's sort of in the space of how to help scientists be more strategic. But rather than focusing on, it's not focused necessarily at the individual level scientists. It's this project I've been working on. So just a little bit of context. So in the United States, we have these long-term ecological research sites. They exist around the world. The United States has this sort of one network of 27 sites that are funded by the National Science Foundation. They're really very much basic science focused. They have some applied research, but they're very much set, that long-term nature is that they're set up for this basic science focus. And they do, it's one of the interesting things about them. They get about $1 million a year. A portion of that, not a big portion, is meant to go to informal science education. That's sort of a required thing. But in fact, most of them do some sort of additional communication activities related to their research. They don't just do youth-oriented informal science education. And also there's an interesting thing about them is they're all part of this one network, but they're different in lots of interesting ways that sort of make the type of research I'm going to talk about kind of interesting. So initially, my colleague and I, Sarah Garlick, who's a wonderful practitioner, she now works for the Nature Conservancy. And I should say, people should stop me at any point and we can ask questions or whatever. I'm happy to chat through any of this. But so the initial research that led to the current research was this project I had with Sarah Garlick, where we were just looking at, so Sarah was at the time was the engagement manager, the engagement boss at Hubbard Brook Research Foundation in New Hampshire. And so we'd also partner with the Harvard Forest LTER. And in both cases was really trying to understand how the scientists at the two sites were thinking about communication, thinking about what their goals were, thinking about how to achieve those goals. We thought we went into it thinking that we were going to do some science comm training and see how the training worked and sort of help them. And what we quickly learned in doing that was the scientists had very little interest in doing SciComm training. They were busy with their research. They did not want to do SciComm training. And one of the interesting things about both of these sites is they had people like Sarah Garlick, and Sarah Garlick had a little team, and Harvard Forest had a similar thing where they had a team of sort of communicators. And as you got into interviewing the scientists, what they said is like, no, I want these guys to help us do the communication. I don't need to be trained to do the communication. We have Sarah, we have Kathy Fallon Lambert, this other wonderful engagement professional. So this idea of us, that's not how we're doing this. We're an organization. We do the communication in partnership with these practitioners. And so that we wrote a couple papers coming out of that, really focused on this idea of, focused on the idea of we really need to put more attention on the organizational level, and particularly the leadership enabling the communication activities, as well as some other stuff. One of the really interesting things that happened in that context was when we started the project, the two forests were very similar in terms of their commitment to engagement. So it was started before the Trump administration. It started before a bunch of things, before a lot of some funding cuts. What happened over the course of the sort of about 4 years is Harvard Forest lost the leadership. They had a leadership change. They had lost some fund. They lost some. Well, they actually had a leadership change and an engagement leader change. And what it really was sort of this natural experiment, really showing how important that infrastructure, having that infrastructure, was to ensuring high quality engagement, and also how fragile it was. As soon as some of those things, whether that leadership sort of commitment went away, it became a very different experience for the scientists at Harvard Forest. And so it was just an interesting thing of just really, so much of our work, a lot of my research is like survey work with scientists and how they think about communication. And this is just like, yeah, that's important, But really, we really need to think about the infrastructure underlying the communication, not so much focus on the individuals. And that sort of led to this sort of the research I'm talking about now, which comes from this second grant where we moved from just this focus on these 2 sites to the whole LTR network, bigger team, really just trying to understand how across all these sites, people were thinking about engagement. There were some different parts to it. So there was one part that was sort of the whole network. We also did some work with 3 specific sites, helping them build up engagement plans that I won't talk about today. And so we were really sort of this one thing like this focus on a few sites, but also just generally trying to understand engagement across the sites. And it's really this trying to understand the engagement across the sites. Excuse me. That's trying to understand the engagement across the sites that comes what I'll talk about today. Underlying, so what I'm talking about today, I won't really spend a ton of time talking about the methods and the data, but this core of this is, so we have interviews, about 37 interviews across the sites, combination of scientists and the practitioners. There's fewer practitioners because some of the practitioners actually do a couple different sites. We didn't do the 3 sites, so there's 24 of the 27 sites represented. We didn't do 3 sites because those are the sites where we were doing deeper work, and so we didn't include them because it would have been duplicative. Really, our initial plan was really just this general sense of like, hey, how are you guys thinking about engagement? But the initial phases of coding where we're just trying to familiarize ourselves with the data got us really thinking about what we were really hearing was this element of, so in this case, it was this partner. We started hearing a lot about all the partners that were involved in the communication. So again, it wasn't the scientists necessarily, and it wasn't necessarily even the staff. Often it was like these partnerships. And so we sort of really, what I'm going to talk about today is really what we think we heard with partnerships. And it may or may not be an insight. I'm really curious to hear from you guys whether or not you think there's any insight here, insightfulness. But the methodology, from a methods perspective, this is just standard. We started with some open coding, worked through to some sort of more, had set up some codes and then identified some themes. The themes were really, however, focused around sort of a little bit weird as themes, but they're really focused around trying to understand the different, sort of categorize the different sites into different partnership categories. One of the things as we were doing that, and again, this is a thing, it's a whole nother paper down on the left there, bottom corner there, that I really love, again, led by Sarah Garlick. As we were thinking about these different sites, and we were thinking like, well, once we categorize the sites, what do we do with those categories? We were using this SCREE framework, SCREE principles that we use, that we encourage people, that we sort of use as part of our grant proposals to talk about, well, how should we think about engagement activities? And so this idea of, when we think about engagement, like we want to think about, well, to what degree are they goal-oriented, strategic? To what degree are they sort of long-term focused, which is cumulative? To what degree are they evidence-based, which is to say, that they're doing something based on theory and based on some sort of logical reasoning, as well as some ethical things, thinking about equity, thinking about to what degree are they really listening? Is their engagement built around listening to the people around them and sort of having two-way discussion, two goals for both people, everybody's benefiting, as well as that reflexivity of changing and responding to what they're hearing and what they're learning. But all this to say that, so the core of it, we're trying to think about, we're categorizing sites, and then we're thinking about, okay, at those sites, what kind of stuff are we hearing about? Like, can we think about how those categories relate to engagement quality using these criteria? Let's see here. So just quick, just taking a little bit of a step back. I want to point out that when you think about an organization and you think about how they can organize for engagement, it is worth thinking about, well, what are their options, right? So one of the ways these sites could have been organized for engagement is they could build an internal communication team. And so if we go back to our original research, Harvard Forest, Harvard Brook, what they had done to improve the quality of their engagement was they hired a leader, Sarah and Kathy, and then they hired people to help those people, and then that engagement staff, that communication staff, supported the scientists. There's another version though, which tends to be like what you see in the private sector, is you can contract, you can hire a public relations firm, you can hire a communications firm, and that's another option for this. we've never seen that in for our perspective, at least in the US context, I rarely see this sort of thing where there's a substantive use of communication firms for that. But so it gives it, and one of the key things is that so in both cases, they're giving us access to technicians, and they're also giving us access to people who can do strategy. So one of the key things from public relations theory is this idea that high quality engagement doesn't just require tacticians, people who can do nice visuals, can write well. It really needs some sort of high level strategist who's thinking about, well, what are we trying? So yes, we can write nicely, but what are we writing nicely about? Why are we choosing the choices we make? And so one of the nice things when you get these sort of multi-person teams is you can have somebody like who's a strategist, but also some technicians. And then you can also, of course, hire those sort of people in. And my sense is from the literature is that much of our research is focused. And so there's some studies here listed that Marta Entradas and Frank and Martin and I've been involved in some of that research, but then other folks doing research looking at some of these organizations, some of the folks out of excuse me, coughing here. Out of Switzerland, some people doing work on trying to understand some of these organizational things, how organizations work. As far as I know, there's very little research looking at SciComm as hiring. This doesn't really exist as far as I can tell. I don't see people studying it. I suspect because it's expensive and that there isn't really firms that can really do the work. All that to say, so that's the background. And so all this, so we have this opportunity. We have 27 sites. We're trying to think like, well, how are these different sites thinking about engagement? And what we find is, there's essentially we create this categorization scheme. And so on the top, we're going to say, let's talk about where they get the resources. Top to bottom is where we get resources, and the left is who does whether stuff is engaged internally. And what we find when we look at these sites is, there's a few sites that try to do what I'll call DIY communication. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have any partners. They just sort of have the LTR money. They do some stuff with that, but essentially there's about a fifth of the sites just try to DIY the engagement. And from an quality perspective, you can really, when you talk to these guys, when you interview these people, you can really hear like, they're sort of doing sort of these one-off activities. They're not really, there's not really discussion across the network, across the organization about what they're doing. They're really sort of, there's not a lot of reflexivity. There's not a lot of evidence-based. They're just sort of these sort of basic engagement communication activities that most of us would say like, okay, yeah. And so that's when those guys, when they just try to DIY it, no partners. Now there was some other sites. Oh, that's right. That's an example of so there's like a quotation from those folks, and it's just like, we're saying that people saying like, we do the best we can. We don't have any money. We're doing the best we can. And so that's interesting. There's a few sites doing that, and those sites tended to be, there was some of the LTR sites are sort of pretty isolated. They just don't have a lot of, they're kind of like out in the Arctic, or they're ones in the Antarctic. There's some ones that just, they don't really have a lot of impetus maybe to do more engagement stuff. They're just not, they don't have stakeholders. They don't have people around them. But generally the key thing is they're just not connected. They're just not really thinking about engagement in any sort of systematic way. And then of course there are the sites that, like where we started with Harvard. One of the things that we really learned from this project was realizing where we started, Harvard Forest, Harvard Brook, how unusual they were. It's really unusual. Like, so there's a few sites like Harvard Forest, Harvard Brook. Here at MSU, we have Kellogg Biological Station. There's the Florida Central Everglades. There are these sites that they're big enough. They don't. So the LTR grant, this NSF grant, is just one of several grants. And so they're able to pool a bunch of resources across different projects. And so they're able to essentially hire. And so when they get the LTR grant, they're able to say, okay, cool, let's sort of fit that into our existing activities. And so that their engagement activities are sort of unified across the structure. They have staff, they can do activities. Now the scientists are still doing plenty, but they have people to help and they're not on their own. Of course, there's nothing in this bottom left category because having no resources and no partners doesn't make any sense. But the thing that I'm most interested in is this top left corner, because I think that's where it's really interesting, where there's these different, so some of the sites, they didn't have any really engagement staff on the grant or in the project, but they still found ways to do engagement that was interesting. And the way that they did that was they found some sort of partner who shared goals with them. And so they didn't hire people really. What they did is they found a partner that so and then there's two types of partnerships. So there was partnerships just to do K-12 stuff. So some of the sites, maybe they just, they partnered with a local informal science education center and did stuff. But more often they found a partner and maybe they started there, but then they used that partner and they started like, oh, okay, what else could we do together? And that partner had their own sources of funds, and the sites maybe brought in funds from other places. And essentially what they did is they outsourced both their activity, their tactics, as well as a lot of this. Eventually, often the people at these partner organizations joined the LTR as sort of in that strategist role and started being part of the thing. And so there was like sort of the LTR sites didn't hire staff, but they did have access to strategists and technicians through these partnerships. And so some of those partners were informal science education places. Some of the sites are based at places that are owned by foundations or owned by a government agency. And so the sites essentially said, hey, we don't have the resources to do it. We have scientists, we have insights, we have things that we want to share. And the partner organization said, put them to work, and said, yeah, we can work with you. We can do that. And so to me, it's just this really interesting thing of they didn't, yeah, it's to me, this is sort of the insight, is that there's this opportunity for, you don't necessarily have to build your own organization to do high quality engagement, to find access to strategy, to find access to technicians. These sites found this other way, which is through partnerships. So we ride the coattails a little bit of our hosts, and so then we think about that in terms of, now it's not perfect, right? So one of the things that, of course, they get access to these strategists, they get access to activities, they get access to broader audiences, because these organizations often came with their own audiences and their own stakeholders, and so they gain this extra thing. On the other hand, some of the engagement activities weren't necessarily, like when I work with scientists to help them think about their communication activities, it's like, well, what do you want to achieve? What are your goals? And often it's like, we want these policymakers to consider our evidence in the context of these decisions. And so that's a little trickier when it comes to, it's a little hard. Sometimes some of these engagement activities that were sort of partner led, they were sort of more general in focus, but not always. But you don't have quite the opportunity to structure them. But otherwise, they still got higher, they got more bang for their buck than if they tried to sort of do everything, that sort of DIY version. And so I do also worry, like to some extent, sometimes some of these places that had partnerships that sort of like became sort of hands-off. People didn't necessarily know the scientists. It was like, oh, no, this other group is taking care of it. We're good. I don't have to think about that because these other people are taking care of it. Now, that's also true of some of the places that hire staff that like, no, they got it. I appreciate they got it. I can worry about my science. But I do feel like there's this danger, really, that if the partner takes too strong a role, you lose. But that's going to be true. Again, that's going to be true regardless. My biggest fear is any sort of distance you put between the engagement activities and the scientists. One of the things, of course, we want to happen when scientists are engaging with folks is that the scientists are learning things and taking in insights and using that to guide their research. And so I do worry about any sort of thing that puts distance between scientists and the people who might use their science. But all that to say, so that we come back to where we want to end that, which is really this idea of, so excellence theory, which I think I sort of skipped over a little bit, but excellence theory from public relations really talks about this, the importance of having an internal communication function, internal communication leadership thing. And I'm not sure that that's true in science. I think it's possible that in the scientific context, we could help scientists be better communicators, not by getting them to hire staff, but by helping them figure out how to do better engagement partnerships. But since doing all this research, I've gone and tried to look for examples within the scientific community where sites are sort of like, really, just imagine like you're a research center and you say like, okay, we're not going to hire engagement. We're going to find this other scientific organization and they're going to be our people. I haven't found much of that outside the LTR context. And so I'm really curious to know if people know of other examples like this. I mean, there's lots of examples of like one-off partnerships. Oh, let's do this event together. But that's not what these things are. These are really like, oh, your engagement person is now going to be on our advising committee. It's much deeper than just sort of these one-off activities. It's these multiple activities. They're writing them into the grants as being our engagement lead is at this organization. I haven't found a ton of that across the scientific community. I'm sure there are other ones that exist. And even beyond the scientific context, if we're just thinking about sort of strategic communication research, does this exist? Does this exist outside of a science context? Is there other places where scientists are, or where organizations of experts are saying, no, we're not going to manage our own communication. We're going to have a partnership organization that isn't, again, we're not hiring them. They have their own goals. They have their own vision. They have their own stuff. But they're going to still be our lead it's just it's a different space. And I'm curious to know, I mean, ultimately, is that a way for scientists to get more? Fundamentally, what I'm thinking about is there more opportunity here for more scientists to get access to help by stopping trying to do stuff themselves and finding organizations? Is there a need for organizations to make themselves more amenable to these types of partnerships? Is there a way of, do museums need to figure out a ways to be this role for more scientific organizations? What does this look like if you expanded these kind of partnerships out? Lots of people behind and part of this team. That's all. It's a big team. There's lots of different moving parts to this grant.